Hello, and welcome to Conquering Finale. My name is Agent Smith, and this is the Measure Number Matrix. Today we're talking about all of the options available to show, hide, and position numbers. And just like everything else in Finale, we have a lot of flexibility to control individual measure numbers, hiding and showing them, moving them around. And measure numbers in particular are incredibly flexible, but with that flexibility comes a lot of complexity, I would say. So bear with me as we get through this video because I suspect this will be a somewhat long one. Now, when you have a measure region set up, you'll have measure numbers showing in specific areas. Obviously, the way I have this one set up is just to show on the start of staff system, not showing every one measure here. But we can always force show a measure number on any measure we want with the measure tool. Just to select the measure here and go to the measure menu and click the option that says show measure number. And when you do that, the measure number will appear. So you're just sort of forcing that measure number upon that measure. Now, there's a few things, actually a lot of things to know about this, so let me just walk you through it. The first is that the position of this measure number will always be determined by whatever the position setting is for the show on every section of the measure number region. Now, even though this is not checked, and you can't even access this position, if you were to check this and change the position around and then uncheck this, that's where the forced measure number would go, right? So it's taking on this position. Now, the next piece of confusion about this is that when you force show a measure number, it will only force show on the staff that you have chosen, and only if it's set up to show on that staff in the score. So in this instance, I only have the measure numbers set up to show on the top staff. So I can force it here, but if I try to do it here, show measure numbers, you'll see that nothing will happen. However, the thing that's really complex and confusing about this, in my opinion, is that if you force show a measure number on this measure right here and go into the part, you'll see that it will also get shown on the part, which is kind of correct. However, it will not get shown on the piano part. Now, this is strange because I think what this is doing is that this option of force showing a measure number is fairly local. So whichever staff you have selected, it will force show. So if I wanted to show this bar number everywhere in the score and parts, I would actually have to select the entire stack and then do the show measure number. And of course, like I said, it's only going to force show it where it's supposed to show on the staff the way you have it set up. But now it will show on the vocal part here and it will show on the piano part. So that's a really strange thing. So, my recommendation is when you are doing these force show measure numbers, make sure that you have the entire stack selected so that you can be sure that it's going to show in all the parts. The other interesting thing is that if you're in a part and you select that measure and force show that measure, what's interesting is that you'll see that it shows, but it's actually unlinked. And what this is really indicating is that it was only showing this measure number on this part. In fact, if I go to the piano part, it doesn't show. If I go to the score, it also doesn't show. So doing the force showing a measure number on a part is sort of a local way to just show that measure number just for that part. So important to be aware of that as well. Now there's actually a couple of shortcuts to do this. So with the measure tool, instead of selecting the measure and going into here, it's not really listed anywhere, but you can actually option click the measure. So hold down option and click the measure and it will appear. Now this is sort of the same thing as doing this locally. So again, it's not going to show on the piano part. It's only going to show on the vocal part in the score and the vocal part in the parts. So that's option click to do that. However, if you press option shift click, it will do the same thing as if you had selected the entire stack and gone into show measure number. So now it will appear in all the parts as well as the score in the appropriate place. Now I believe if I option click the piano part here, let's see. Yeah, you can sort of get into a situation like this where, I option click the piano part in the score, but it's only showing in the piano part now, but not in the score, just because of the way that I have the measure numbers showing in this instance. I believe that if I were to go into here and uncheck exclude other staffs, that should show measure numbers on the piano part as well, and you'll see what happens is that measure number will actually appear here as well. So using that option click, using the select to choose a specific measure to force show this measure number is really, fraught with danger. I guess I would say, in that you really have to be careful about what it is you want to do. My best suggestion is either to, get a stack selection here and do the show measure numbers, or option shift click any measure, because chances are you're going to want that measure number to appear everywhere if you're force showing it. Now, once you have a measure number showing like this, it is possible to undo this, and with any measure number you'll see that there's a handle there, and if you right click this you'll pull up a contextual menu, and we're going to go through some of these options today in this lesson. But the first one I want to look at is the one here called show/hide based on region. Now, because this measure number is actually forced on, it's not supposed to be there. So if I select this option, it's going to revert to the way it's supposed to be, which is that it's not going to be there. If I were to try to do that here, show hide based on region, obviously this measure number is supposed to be showing, so obviously nothing's going to change in that particular case. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set this up just slightly differently for a second. I'm going to not exclude other staffs, and I'm going to show on every one measure so I can set up a little bit of a different situation here. So now I've got measure numbers on every bar, on the vocals, and the piano staff. The next thing I want to really look at is in this contextual menu, there's a couple options here: always show number and always hide number. Now, if there's a measure number there, clicking this always show number, which has a shortcut, what is that, Option Shift Command H on a Mac, will do nothing because it's already showing. But we can choose this option to always hide the number, and it doesn't go away, but you can kind of see that, I hope, on my screen, that it gets grayed out, which means that this will not print. And you'll see that it doesn't do that to the measure number below. So this always show, always hide number contextual menu, and by the way, you don't even have to be in the measure tool. This is from the selection tool. You can right click and get these options. These always show number and always hide number is sort of hyper local in that sense, that it will hide it on the particular staff that you selected. Now, it will also hide it in the part as well, because you can see that it's not orange, so this is actually not unlinked. Of course, it will appear in the piano part because I did not hide this version of it, or this instance of it. Now, the other shortcut way of actually hiding these measure numbers in that way, you don't have to go into the contextual menu. You can just select it and actually press delete, which is strange because you think it would go away, but really all it's doing is just selecting the always hide option. And if you press delete again, nothing happens, but you can always do the always show, which is, what is that? Again, Option Command Shift H, Option Command Shift H, and you'll see that it will show. And actually that keystroke combination will toggle it on and off. So you see it hides, deselects though when you do that, and shows. So there's some flexibility with that as well. Also in that contextual menu, the next thing I want to look at is the first option here for Edit Enclosure. So we can actually force an enclosure on any particular measure number that we want. And when you do this, the Enclosure Designer will come up, which I'm not going to talk about. There's a great video in the expression category 15-4B that talks about this in depth. It's the same exact Enclosure Designer. You have the same exact options. It all works the same. The one difference here is that you do have this one option here called Use Default Enclosure, which I'll get to in a second. But when you initially open this Enclosure Designer in this way by right-clicking a measure number, the way that this is set up, I'll just cancel out of here for a second, will be set up exactly the same way that the Enclosure Designer is set up for the show on every setting. So you can see the settings here. These numbers will match. Even though this is deselected, it doesn't matter. It's taking on the properties of this Enclosure Designer here. And so we go back here, we do Edit Enclosure, and these settings are set up exactly the same way. And if I click OK, you can see that it will put an enclosure just on that measure number. So again, it's pretty local, so it's not going to put it on the one at the piano part. And you'll see that it will also put it on the one in the part, and again, not in the piano part, etc. So that's sort of how that works. Now, the other thing within that edit enclosure designer, actually, let's go ahead and make a different type of enclosure here. I'm going to use the ellipse for a second and just have a circle there. If you go to the edit enclosure again and choose the use default enclosure, this will revert it back to the state of the enclosure from the measure number region dialog box for the show on every. So that setting that I just showed you in the measure number region dialog box, right? However, if the enclosures are not set, in this case they aren't because there's no enclosures anywhere else, pressing this button will actually remove it, right? So if I were to go, let's just do this, choose an enclosure for this, and then edit enclosure, we can actually choose a different enclosure for this one, and you'll see that just this bar number will have that enclosure, but of course if I go back and choose use default, it will revert to the square. So there's a lot going on there, but reverting to default, if there is no enclosure selected for these measure numbers, will basically remove it. Let me talk about the next option in the contextual menu here called Restore Defaults. Now this will do mostly what you think it will, but not exactly everything. Basically what it will do is it will remove manual adjustments if you make if you drag it around to a different place. It will remove the state of the hiding. In this case I hid it, so if I do the remove manual adjustments, it will re-show that. And it will also essentially select the show hide based on region option as well. Now in this case, this number is supposed to be there anyway, so nothing's going to change as far as it being there or not being there. But restoring defaults would actually send it back to the where it originally was, and it would also show it as well. What it will not do is if you have an enclosure around this measure number, it will not undo that. So that's one thing the restore defaults will not do. You would have to go in here and do the use default enclosure to remove that. It will also not relink things. I'm going to show you linking and unlinking in a second, but if the measure number is unlinked now, you can restore the defaults, which will move it back to its original position, but it will remain unlinked, which is I think a little bit more relevant when you start looking at the options, or when you start moving things around in the part. So again, if I were to in the part move this, I can restore defaults. It will move it back to its original position, but it will not relink it. Speaking of linking and unlinking, let me go over to this other file because this is set up a little bit differently. There's a lot more parts here. Linking is somewhat complex with measure numbers because of a weird thing that Finale considers here, and let me see if I can try to explain this. So, obviously I have these measure number regions set up in a way where the score is showing, as you can see, just on the bottom staff. Below the bottom staff, it's box numbers. The parts are showing. The parts are showing every measure in a completely different position, not boxed. You can see the bottom left corner here. So a completely different setup. And obviously what you're seeing here is the flute part. There's bar numbers here in the flute part itself, but obviously there's no bar numbers on the flute line in the score. However, the way that Finale considers these measure numbers as far as linking and unlinking is concerned is that when you move one of these measure numbers in the part, you'll see that it unlinks. Now that's a normal behavior when you're moving anything in the part. Like if I move the forte, it gets unlinked as well. Now it's weird to think that this is unlinked because it doesn't seem that there's anything linked to it in the score, right? There's nothing to link to. However, Finale does consider the bar numbers existing in the score, I guess. So they are here somewhere. They're just not showing. So what you're actually unlinking in this regard is the measure number from the invisible measure numbers from the score, if that makes sense. Now, if I were to go and let me see if I can do this right. If I were to go back into the score and go into the score setting and show on top staff, I believe that measure number that I moved, measure number 8 right here, is now orange. So you can see what I'm talking about. Now that the measure numbers are showing on the flute 1 part, you can see that how that gets unlinked like that. So so that's sort of what's going on. It's a little bit confusing. Now this has a little bit of implications in certain circumstances. For example, if you look at the score here, I have measure numbers at the bottom of the score, and they're effectively attached to the double bass staff, right? They're below the double bass staff. So this is the weird part, in my opinion. Even though the positions are completely different between the score and the parts, when you move these measure numbers, right, and when you move something in a score, it doesn't unlink. Remember, that's sort of how linking and unlinking works in Finale. This won't affect any of the parts other than the bass part. So if I go into the violin 1 part, this measure number is in its original place. It's not affected. Same with violin 2, viola, cello. However, if you can see this, the double bass part, this 1 is now all the way in the staff here in a completely inappropriate place. Because the measure number did not get unlinked when I moved it directly in the score like that. So that is a strange behavior as far as I'm concerned, but that's what's going on. So my advice to you when you do have to move measure numbers in the score is to always unlink them first. And of course we can right click to actually unlink right here directly, and then we'll turn orange. But if you're familiar with this, the quicker way to do this is just hold down the command key and drag it. And that will drag it while unlinking it at the same time. And now if we go back to the bass part, you'll see that the number 1 here is in its original position. It's orange, meaning that it's unlinked, but it's still in its original position, which is what you want to do. So just a word of warning, my advice is, and anytime you move a measure number in a score, particularly in a situation like this where it's only showing on one staff or whatever, definitely unlink. And of course we can always relink in all the parts, and we have these keystroke combinations if you want to memorize these. That's Option Shift Command U and Option Shift Command L for unlinking and relinking. Now, since we're talking about manually positioning measure numbers, let me just give you a couple tips for this. Sort of the usual thing. I'm in the part right now, so I'm looking at all these measure numbers. The one thing about measure numbers, and this is true in any notation program, there really is no perfect position for a measure number. Eventually, the measure numbers are going to conflict with something. It depends on the part. Actually, this flute part is actually pretty good. There's not a whole lot of notes that go too low, but let's go to something else where this would be more of a problem. Like in this bassoon part, yeah, you've got the measure 156 is encroaching on the stems here. I mean, it's just impossible to pick a single measure number position that will completely avoid everything. So this is the dirty work of being a copyist, is always finding these conflicts and resolving them. Finale does not have automatic avoidance with measure numbers at all. Which is, it's difficult to program. I imagine that they made a choice just not to deal with it, at least not right now. Some other programs do have this, but, sometimes the results are not necessarily predictable or what you want all the time, so you end up moving things around anyway. But when you do have to move things around, the usual stuff with moving things around apply to the measure numbers. So, of course, you can just grab it and move it. And, of course, I'm in a part, so when you move it from a part, it unlinks. You can use the arrow keys to nudge something, either which way, left, down, right, up, whatever you want to do. The shift key, of course, will constrain the dragging to one axis, so you won't be able to accidentally move it up and down. If you go left or right first, or vice versa, shift down will prevent you from moving it left or right. It'll help keep things aligned. As I just mentioned before, if you're in the score, it's not so important in the part, but if you're in the score, the command key will move the measure numbers and unlink it at the same time. The other thing that's handy to do is you can select a bunch of them all at once. So in this case, I've selected, 15, 16, 17, 18. And in this case, I could just use the arrow keys to nudge them over to the left a little bit to just help them avoid the corner of that beam right there, which will look a little nicer. So, don't be afraid to get down and dirty and lasso select a bunch of them if you need to, and move them around. Now, here is an absolute pro tip for dealing with moving measure numbers around. So in this particular file, I've gone ahead and I've done some manual changing of the bar numbers towards the end of the piece. After bar 300, you can see in this bassoon part, I've got some measure numbers here. Here's the bassoon 2. Let's see, what else do I got? Yeah, just after measure 300, I took some time to actually move these measure numbers. And the tip here that I want to give you is kind of critical. So when you're dealing with measure number regions and you want to do some stuff where you're skipping measure numbers, the important thing to realize is that when you make those manual movements, they're actually kind of tied to the region in a way. So if you have this file and you've decided that, okay, it needs to go from measure 1 to 4, and then we're going to skip 5, 6, 7, 8, and start. And the fifth bar is going to be bar 9. You might think that the best way to do this is to do measures 1 through 4, add a region, and include measures 5 through 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, and starting measure 9. And that seems like the most logical thing to do, right? And that will work. You get 1 through 4, 9 through the end. However, when you do that, it completely blows out all of the changes that you've made to the positions of those measure numbers. So this is really not good, particularly if you have 300 plus measures of measure number adjustments that you've made. So as I undo this, you can see that all these orange numbers here have gone away, and those positions have completely gotten destroyed. So the tip here is that wherever you're making this change, try to retain as much of the region as possible. So in this case, instead of changing this region to include measures 1 through 4, I'm actually going to make this the second region. So I'm going to include measures 5 through 999, and starting with measure 9, and then add another one that's only 1 through 4. Starting with measure number 1, right? Now they're out of order, which is fine. You can just sort them if you want to. But now because you've retained that original measure number region, all of those adjustments that you've made will also be retained in the file. So that's sort of an important thing to do if you're dealing with these types of measure skips and measure number skips and all that stuff. So absolute pro tip right there. And the idea is that wherever that change needs to be, you can't avoid this completely. If the change is in the middle of the file, obviously you're going to have to make a decision about, like, okay, I have to, retain half of the measure number region, which means I'm going to have to redo the positions of the other half. But the idea is that you try to keep as much of the measure region as possible. One last thing that I want to talk about related to measure numbers showing and appearing in different places is the expression for the rehearsal marks that is the measure number. There's this one expression here in the rehearsal marks category for measure number, which will show the actual measure number in a box, depending on how you have it shown. And when you assign this, you'll see that you'll get the measure number 13 there. Now, when you use this option, you'll see that it will also make the measure number here disappear. Now, this is actually a part of the setting of the expression, not of the measure number. So if we go into this expression and check out what's going on here, we press the edit button. It's this option here called hide measure number for this measure number expression. Now, this is checked by default in the default document, but if you uncheck that and assign that, you can see that now you will be able to see the rehearsal mark 13 as well as the actual measure number 13. It's sort of your choice. I always choose to do it this way so that it's hiding the measure number so that it's not redundant. The other thing about this is that it will only hide it on that particular staff that's showing. So in this case, in the score, the way this expression is set up, it's set up to only show on the flute, but the flute doesn't actually have measure numbers appearing in the score. the measure numbers appear at the bottom of the score in the double bass. And in this case, this measure number expression will not hide the measure number at the bottom of the score, which I think probably makes sense, because you know, if you're looking at this particular score like this, you wouldn't want to have this 13 disappear in favor of this one up here. So that's kind of how that works. It's actually a setting within the expression itself. It's not a setting in the measure number region dialog box. All right, so yeah, I knew this was going to be a long video, but hopefully this all makes sense to you now. And yeah, so that's it. So thanks for watching. Come back. The next video, I'm going to start talking about a couple of measure number plugins that I think are really handy and sort of important to know about. So we'll take a look at those next. All right, thanks for watching this exceptionally long video today, and I appreciate it. And I will see you soon on the next video.